I think quite simply, systemic change is really educational change informed by systems theory. I think educational change comes in all sorts, an infinite variety of ways. People are often unsatisfied with one output or one process that happens in our schools or our school systems, and so the desire for change in schools is pretty strong. The communities I work with are generally underserved communities where you have multiple social systems not working optimally, education being one of those. I think what makes educational change systemic is the application of systems theory, which forces us to look at boundaries and environments and fixed operations and fluid operations. And I've been influenced a lot by Bella Banathy's work, which asks us to look at complex systems with a set of tools that makes it rather simpler to break them into their constituent pieces, look at them, and understand how they function as individuals and how they function as a collective wholes. I work with a school in New Orleans that was created by a group of neighbors who didn't like the school that they worked with, that was in their community. It wasn't serving all of the kids in the school, and through a meteorological incident, they decided that they were going to open a school and not only open a school, because that's sort of a vanilla activity, but they decided they were going to make children the centerpiece of their community. And that involves schools and the other attendant things that have to do with children. And what happened in the creation of this group of neighbors, essentially, is that they had to answer all sorts of questions about what it takes to build a school. Some people had a lot of experience. I was a former teacher and professor at the local college of education. I had a lot of vocabulary I could add to the game, but I didn't know that many people. This wasn't my neighborhood where I was born. A lot of people could bring that to the table. And we had a diverse group of people come together to build a school. And now that they have opened the school, they hired a principal, they have a curriculum that they were very enthusiastic about. It attracted a diverse group of students to a public school, which is in our city a challenge. Now that they own the school, they've begun a project of advocacy to work with other communities so that they can contain and get ownership over their schools. Normally, we think of a reform or creation of a single school as something that's unsystemic because it's going to work with a single school, but all the forces external to that school will sort of rein it in and constrain how unique or how different it can be from the mold that the external system wants. But in this case, that reform is absolutely systemic because it's very aware that there is an external system and that it plays certain roles on what happens in the internal functioning of the school, but it's taken that on as a challenge. So this is that's an example of a reform that is by all means systemic because it's informed that there's a greater system outside of a school that needs addressing, but it doesn't start at the level of a full system, a full district, a full city. And I think sometimes we get trapped into word games about what systemic change can be, and I think using that definition of change informed by systems theory is a nice way to cast a broad tent to make sure that the people who are interested in the same things that we're interested in want to join the work that we do here in the division. I think distinguishing if systemic change is defined as change informed by systems theory, then the test of a change being systemic or not is mapping some of the pieces of systems theory onto what's happening at the change. And are there multiple connections between systems theory and what's happening on the ground? And if so, that probably meets some sort of heuristic test of a change being systemic. Our case of our school in New Orleans, if our mission was to build a great neighborhood school so the kids in our neighborhood were well served, we might have been a systemic change effort if we're defining the system as the neighborhood our kids are served in, right? Because a system is defined by its boundaries. And so I think we usually find that unsatisfying to have a single school do well, because oftentimes that single school will attract resources and students and talent from other schools, right? So there is a bigger system, and so we found it inelegant to draw our system that way. So we drew our system as the city, but that's an arbitrary choice, I think. But the city of New Orleans presents all sorts of problems, but it's a much more self-contained entity than the neighborhood of the school is, and so because of fiscal and policy and governance structures, they generally reach that entire area. And so I don't think we could argue that charter schools are not systemic change and prove that intent beyond a shadow of a doubt. I don't think standards-based reform, we can argue, is not a systemic change. I think the devil is in the details of how change gets planned, implemented, evaluated, and sustained or not sustained, and that is what makes a change systemic. And so I think it's an awfully challenging task, but it also might not be that important to be able to determine if a change is systemic or not. I think a group or an individual that sees itself systemically recognizes the need for friends in all sorts of places. I think the way we've traditionally structured K-12 education, at least in this country, has been pretty hierarchical, and there have generally been a single or maybe two sources of where most of what I need comes from. If I'm in a school district, my money is coming mostly from the local district and from the state. All the supplies I need are coming from the clearinghouse that the district operates. My community relations all happens through that district office. And so schools, under a hierarchical system, have really no incentive to think systemically, or at least there's challenges to thinking systemically in the day-to-day, because there's only one or two pipelines where resources come in and out of the school. In the environment in which we've worked, which is a massively decentralized school system, all schools are forced to think about the multiple ways where their resources come from, where help is, where friends are, what's the task that's going to get done, from having to find a new building for recruiting new students and teachers to ensuring that school improvement is happening because there isn't a district person coming in to watch my school. And so this is a unique organizational context where I think schools in New Orleans, at least, have been forced to think systemically, because they're not separated from the system by any sort of structures anymore. An interesting thought experiment might be, how do we replicate that sort of innovativeness, or viewing a school as a little bit more of a free agent in its community than we typically think, I think. And I think we have a lot to learn from the private school community about that, because private schools have tended to do a better job locating resources in diverse pockets, leveraging the relationships they have with the families they serve and the community that they're in, because their resources come directly locally from that community, much more than a strict pipeline coming out of the state. And so if K-12 schools can organize themselves as living, breathing entities that represent everything, challenges and successes of a community, then a problem in the school is a problem in the community, and the community is ready to help solve. If a school views itself as serving one small isolated function for a community and just operating in its turtle shell, well, then the help is not going to be there, and the support and the ideas for change are not going to be there. And so I think it's very important to find a way for schools to take ownership for their success. And I think bureaucratic structures historically have made that really hard. Now, I don't want to have a hurricane knock a school system under the ground in every city in the country, so how can we accomplish that through less turbulent means, perhaps? And I think when schools have autonomy on curriculum and autonomy on staffing, and schools are forced to form relationships with the families that they served and the community resources that exist by not having stuff spoon-fed to them. So perhaps some of our schools need to be nudged out of the nest a little bit, and maybe perhaps then they can learn to fly. But without schools taking serious independent ownership for how they exist in the world, that really fosters this systemic view, and how we do that within the schools we have without disrupting. And these are our children in these schools, so we don't want to kick them out of the nest, too hard. So how do we do that in a way that reaps the benefits of sort of autonomous actors without making the whole thing come crashing to the ground? I think the biggest challenge to having systemic change being a way of operation for more schools is this complete lack of a sense of agency that current system of school fosters in teachers, in individual schools, particularly low-income schools that are seen as the objects of policy and the objects of initiatives and not the creative, generative sources of their own solution to their own problems. Systemic change requires that people within the system and trusted friends from without of the system, in the community, in the environment, come together and own the current performance and commit to doing what it takes to get performance where they want it, which includes, by the way, serious and complicated conversations about what optimal performance ought to be, because that's by no means a settled issue. The federal government has tried to sort of to chime in on that subject, but we need to have a lot more complicated conversation about what an educated person looks like and how do we build a school to hit that. I think we're making progress, but hit and miss. So this sense of agency that many schools and individual teachers and communities have forever lacked, I think, in regards to school, has a lot to do with our trust of experts and their ability to solve our problems for us. It's had a lot to do with the low status of teaching as a profession and the lack of trust that the American public is given. I was born in the 70s, which is sort of when trust of teachers sort of began to sort of dwindle, and now it's at an all-time low if you look at the Ed Week reports and those kind of things. So I mean, that needs to change. A school can't own its problems and have the ability to create new solutions to the complicated problems they have unless teachers believe that they, A, are worthy of doing it, B, can do it, and B, will have support once they've done it. And so fostering that sense of agency, I think, starts with small victories. And I think Charlie's worked on leveraging small victories to move a school closer to where it wants to go, which has the benefit of, well, just making things a little bit better for our kids and outcomes, but also building agency within a school and a broader community about we can solve our own problems. There was a principal in New Orleans leading a school the first year after Hurricane Katrina, and they had gotten their backpacks donated from a big backpack company and their school buses donated from somebody in Virginia, and they were a charity case the whole year, and by necessity, because they didn't have money to replace a lot of the stuff. It came to the end of that year, and a couple of celebrities had lined up to offer to pay for their graduation at a downtown theater or something, and the principal said, you know what? No, we can't have everybody doing this for us. We need to have it ourselves. So they had a raggedy school auditorium with ripped curtains, and they went in there and they cleaned up the senior class, took it as their project, and they took the curtains down, they slopped a little fresh paint on there and mopped the floor, and it didn't look like the downtown theater, but it was their building, it was their parents, it was in their neighborhood, and they owned what was happening there. And this small little sense of agency that grew out of that, I think, is a pretty powerful thing. And it's hard, it's something that's difficult to plan for. I think building agency requires educators on the ground sort of whispering to each other, yeah, you can do this, we can do this, and we don't give ourselves much opportunity to do that. But I think that's what wise leaders do. Yeah, no, I think there is. I mean, I think I have problems to point out with doing that. I think arriving at shared values hard to argue with. Let's not. Let's just keep our values to ourselves and build a school anyway. So that seems destined to fail. So it's a reasonable thing to do, but it's a much more murky process to dig in and involve, and there are plenty of educational change activists who maybe don't want to go there because in particularly in diverse communities where you have all sorts of political and social inequalities, how do you arrive at shared values when they don't necessarily exist? Can you create them? And I think that process probably has to get a lot more thought if we're truly going to do it well. But I think very few communities are able to do that. I also think aspirational values put out by educators in consultation with groups in the community can serve as a proxy for shared values. I think our division at its core has got some really well thought out processes for how to bring people together to talk about what they want and go backwards from there to build structures and capacity to accomplish what they want. That's an entire process predicated on relationships. Relationships are predicated on some history of interaction and trust. And I think what we ought to be thinking about is not how do we become better facilitators to take our work out to the world, because I ultimately don't think we can do that. And this discussion's come up again and again. Who is it that has to initiate this? And I think perhaps our work is finding leaders in communities that can be point people on this, and identifying potential local leaders that can work the network where they are and make that happen, rather than taking a front and center approach. And it's hard to do, and everyone wants to stay on the side and support, but leaders don't emerge naturally sometimes. And so how do we as facilitators for deep transformation engage in a community in a way that's respectful, but bring some of our hard work and thinking to bear? I think we're going to have that conversation about, it's almost an anthropological one, about what's our role as an outsider, insider, and that has moral implications and has practical implications. And I think that's an area that I hope we'll see continued interest here in the division as we sort of navigate that murky water.